Hello, my dear friends. As the night grows quiet and the modern world slowly fades into stillness, let us step back into a time when survival was not a concept, but a daily responsibility. The medieval world was not built for comfort. It was built for endurance. Every day carried uncertainty and every night demanded preparation. People did not assume safety. They created it slowly, carefully, using knowledge passed through generations. In medieval life, survival techniques were not written in books or taught in formal lessons. They were learned through observation, repetition, and memory. Children absorbed them by watching adults. Mistakes were remembered, sometimes painfully, and those memories shaped behavior. What we now call forgotten techniques were once ordinary habits, woven quietly into daily life. One of the most important medieval survival principles was anticipation. People did not wait for danger to appear. They assumed it would. Weather, illness, hunger, and violence were expected. Because of this, preparation was constant. Homes were arranged not for beauty but for function. Tools were kept close. Supplies were stored early. Nothing was trusted to chance. Medieval homes themselves were survival tools. Thick walls, small windows, and low ceilings were not signs of ignorance. They were deliberate choices. Small windows reduced heat loss and limited exposure. Thick walls slowed temperature changes. Darkness inside the home was accepted because warmth mattered more than light. We now design homes to feel open. Medieval people designed homes to feel safe. Fire management was another forgotten skill. Fire was not just warmth, it was timing. Medieval people understood that fire burned differently depending on fuel, airflow, and placement. They knew how to keep embers alive for hours without flame. A dying fire could be revived in the morning, saving fuel. Fire was never treated casually. It was guarded, fed, and respected. Food survival went far beyond preservation. Medieval people understood energy balance deeply. They knew which foods warmed the body and which weakened it. Heavy grains, fats, and slow-digesting meals were eaten before hard days or cold nights. Light foods were avoided when endurance was needed. Eating was strategy, not preference. Another survival technique was controlled movement. Medieval people did not move unnecessarily. Walking, working, or traveling wasted energy. Energy loss meant vulnerability. When conditions were harsh, people stayed still. They waited. This patience is something modern life has almost completely erased. Clothing was treated as equipment, not fashion. Layers were adjusted constantly. Wet cloth was dangerous. Medieval people changed behavior to keep clothing dry rather than relying on extra garments. Cloaks were wrapped to block wind, not just cover the body. Head coverings were essential. Losing heat through the head was understood long before science explained it. Community survival was perhaps the most ignored technique of all. Medieval people survived because they were not isolated. Knowledge, food, and protection were shared. A household that failed alone endangered others. Survival created cooperation not through kindness but necessity. Independence was dangerous, interdependence was safety. Silence was also a survival skill. Medieval nights were quiet for a reason. Noise attracted attention, human or animal. Silence preserved energy and awareness. People listened more than they spoke. Sound carried information, wind changes, footsteps, animals, danger. Listening mattered. Illness was handled with patience rather than panic. Medieval people knew that sudden movement, exposure, or fear weakened the body. Rest, warmth, and routine were primary treatments. While medicine was limited, behavior often saved lives. Another forgotten technique was acceptance of discomfort. Medieval people did not expect to be comfortable. They expected to survive. This mindset reduced stress. Stress wasted energy. Accepting discomfort allowed focus on what mattered. Even sleep was strategic. People slept lightly during danger or cold. Deep sleep was luxury. Waking often was normal. Awareness continued even during rest. This protected against fire failure, intrusion, or weather change. The medieval world was harsh but not careless. Survival was built from small, repeated actions rather than dramatic heroism. What we now see as primitive was often refined through centuries of lived experience. As this first long part settles into the quiet of the night, imagine a world where every habit mattered, where survival depended on memory, restraint, and preparation. These techniques were not lost because they failed. They were forgotten because the world changed. And as we rest here, we prepare to move deeper into this forgotten knowledge, piece by piece, habit by habit, night by night. As the medieval night stretched on, survival often depended less on strength and more on restraint. One of the most important survival techniques in medieval life was food control, a skill so ordinary at the time that it was rarely written down, yet so powerful that entire communities depended on it to endure long winters, sieges, and repeated crop failures. Medieval people lived with the constant awareness that food was never guaranteed. Harvests could fail, weather could turn suddenly, war could empty storehouses overnight. Because of this uncertainty, food was never treated casually. Eating was not only nourishment, it was planning for the future. Households did not think in terms of meals for today alone. They thought in terms of weeks, months, and seasons. Grain stores were guarded carefully. Flour was measured. Bread was baked with intention. Every portion taken from storage carried the weight of future hunger. This awareness shaped behavior deeply. One of the most forgotten techniques was rationing without panic. Medieval people did not wait until food was nearly gone to change habits. As soon as signs of scarcity appeared, portions were quietly reduced. Meals became simpler, ingredients were stretched. Hunger was accepted early so that starvation could be avoided later. This early restraint saved lives. Fasting was another survival method, not only religious but practical. Medieval fasting days reduced consumption without framing it as crisis. By turning restraint into routine, communities conserved food without fear. Hunger felt purposeful rather than frightening. Food hierarchy inside households also mattered. Children, elders, and those performing heavy labor were prioritized during scarcity. This was not sentiment alone. It was strategy. Preserving the vulnerable and the useful preserved the household's future. Another overlooked technique was food timing. Medieval people understood that eating at the right time mattered as much as eating enough. Heavy meals were eaten before cold nights or hard labor. Light meals were eaten when rest followed. Digestion produced warmth. This knowledge was practical, not scientific, but deeply effective. Leftovers were never wasted. Bones were boiled repeatedly for broth. Stale bread was softened, reused, or ground. Even peels and scraps were saved when possible. Waste was dangerous behavior. It threatened survival not only of the individual, but of the group. Medieval people also practiced quiet hunger. Complaining about hunger was discouraged. It weakened morale and increased anxiety. Hunger was acknowledged privately, not loudly. This emotional restraint kept communities stable during long shortages. Food storage itself was a survival skill. Grain was kept dry, elevated, and protected from pests. Root vegetables were stored in cool, dark spaces. Meat was dried, salted, or smoked carefully. Spoilage was watched constantly. A single mold outbreak could threaten an entire winter's supply. During sieges or extreme scarcity, people adjusted expectations further. Meals became symbolic rather than filling. Eating something, anything, maintained routine and morale. Routine itself was survival. Another forgotten technique was collective sharing during crisis. While medieval life could be harsh, communities understood that hoarding increased long-term risk. A starving neighbor weakened defense, labor, and support. Sharing, though painful, increased overall survival odds. Children learned these lessons early. They watched adults measure food, reduce portions, and remain calm. Hunger became familiar, but not terrifying. This emotional education mattered as much as calories. Food was also tied to silence. Eating quietly conserved energy. Meals were moments of focus, not entertainment. This reduced waste and preserved strength. Medieval people survived repeated hunger not because they were stronger than us, but because they were trained by habit to live within limits. Their techniques were slow, unglamorous, and deeply effective. As this long part settles into the stillness of the night, imagine a dim medieval home. A small meal shared slowly, portions measured with care, hunger acknowledged, but controlled. Survival continues not through abundance, but through discipline learned over generations. In the medieval world, survival depended heavily on something most people rarely thought about directly: water. Clean water was never guaranteed, and yet daily life depended on it completely. Medieval people did not understand bacteria or germs in the modern sense, but through long experience they learned patterns. They learned which water made people sick and which allowed them to survive. One of the most important survival techniques was water selection. Medieval communities did not drink from just any source. Flowing water was preferred over still water. Springs were valued highly. Wells were protected carefully. Water that smelled bad, looked cloudy, or tasted strange was avoided whenever possible. These decisions were not superstition. They were memory-based survival choices. Settlements were built around reliable water sources. A good spring or clean stream could determine whether a village survived for generations or failed within years. This is why many medieval towns existed where they did. Geography was survival. Water storage was handled with care. Containers were cleaned regularly. Wooden barrels were preferred for certain uses. Stagnant water inside the home was avoided when possible. Medieval people learned that standing water brought illness, even if they could not explain why. Boiling water was another quiet survival technique. While not always practiced daily, boiling was used during sickness, childbirth, or when water quality was uncertain. Heat made water safer. This knowledge came from observation, not science. Those who boiled water during outbreaks survived more often. Alcoholic drinks like ale and weak beer played a major role in survival. These drinks were safer than untreated water because the brewing process killed harmful elements. Ale was consumed daily, including by children, because it was often safer than water. This was not indulgence, it was protection. Another forgotten technique was separation of waste and water. Medieval towns that survived longer learned to keep waste downhill and downstream from water sources. Latrines were placed carefully. Waste pits were dug away from wells. These practices were not perfect, but they reduced contamination. Bathing was limited, but cleaning mattered. Hands were washed before food preparation when possible. Cooking vessels were rinsed. Clothing was aired and cleaned periodically. Cleanliness was not about comfort. It was about avoiding sickness that could weaken the body beyond recovery. During outbreaks of disease, medieval people practiced behavioral isolation. Sick individuals were kept separate when possible. Shared utensils were avoided. Visitors were limited. These actions were learned through painful experience. Communities that ignored them lost more people. Smell played an important role in medieval survival. People trusted their senses deeply. Bad smells were associated with danger. While the explanation was flawed, the behavior often reduced exposure to harmful environments. Avoiding foul air meant avoiding decay, waste, and stagnant water. Seasonal awareness mattered. Water sources changed with weather. Spring floods contaminated wells. Summer heat increased spoilage. Medieval people adjusted behavior with seasons, shifting sources and routines accordingly. Children learned water discipline early. They were warned not to drink from random streams or puddles. These rules were enforced strictly. Disobedience could lead to illness or death. Water was never taken for granted. It was watched, managed, protected, and respected. Survival depended on it every day, not just during crisis. As this long part settles into the quiet rhythm of medieval life, imagine a small settlement waking slowly, water drawn carefully, containers cleaned, choices made quietly based on memory rather than theory. These habits were invisible, but they kept people alive. In the medieval world, survival often began before a single wall was raised or a roof was placed. Shelter was not chosen for beauty, view, or convenience. It was chosen for protection. The land itself was studied carefully, because the wrong placement of a home could shorten lives long before hunger or illness ever appeared. Medieval people understood the movement of wind deeply. Homes were rarely built on open hilltops unless defense demanded it. Wind stripped heat from the body and from buildings. Cold drafts weakened walls, roofs, and people alike. Villages were placed behind natural barriers, trees, hills, rock formations that slowed harsh winds. This reduced heat loss and protected structures during storms. Sunlight mattered even more. Medieval homes were often positioned to catch the weakest winter sun. Openings faced directions that allowed light to enter during colder months. This light provided warmth, dried damp interiors, and lifted morale during long seasons of darkness. Shade was not valued, warmth was. Ground selection was another quiet survival skill. Low land collected water and cold air. Flooding and dampness caused illness and rot. Experienced builders chose slightly elevated ground, high enough to drain water, but low enough to remain sheltered. This balance was learned through loss and memory. Walls were built thick for a reason. Stone, packed earth, timber, and wattle and daub were layered not to impress but to insulate. Thick walls slowed temperature change. Heat escaped more slowly. Cold entered more gradually. This made interiors more stable, especially at night. Windows were kept small. Light was sacrificed for warmth. Large openings invited cold air, rain, and snow. Medieval people accepted dim interiors because darkness was safer than freezing. Openings were covered with cloth, shutters, or animal skins during storms. Roofs were shaped for survival. Steep roofs shed snow quickly, preventing collapse. Thatch and wooden shingles trapped air, creating insulation. Roofs were inspected constantly during winter, because failure overhead could destroy an entire household overnight. Fire placement inside the shelter was intentional. Hearths were placed centrally, not near walls. Heat spread evenly. Smoke rose through roof openings, drying beams and discouraging pests. Smoke irritated eyes, but it preserved structures and warmth. Floors were another forgotten survival detail. Bare earth absorbed moisture and cold. Many medieval homes used packed earth mixed with straw or rushes. These materials trapped warmth and reduced dampness. Floors were refreshed regularly to maintain insulation. Furniture was minimal and functional. Beds were raised off the ground to avoid cold air pooling near the floor. Storage was elevated to protect food from dampness and pests. Everything inside the home served survival first. Doorways were kept low and narrow. This reduced heat loss and forced slower movement, preventing gusts of cold air from rushing inside. Doors were sealed with cloth or straw during extreme weather. Maintenance was constant. Small cracks were repaired immediately. Leaks were blocked. Ignoring damage allowed cold, dampness, and pests to enter. Survival depended on vigilance. Communal shelters also existed. In extreme conditions, people gathered together, sharing warmth and protection. Isolation was dangerous. Shelter was as much about proximity as structure. Medieval people did not trust shelters blindly. They listened. Walls creaked, roofs shifted. Sounds warned of failure. Awareness continued even during rest. These shelters were not comfortable by modern standards. They were dark, smoky, and cramped, but they worked. They kept people alive through storms, freezes, and long winters. As this long part settles into stillness, imagine a medieval village at night. Low roofs huddle against the wind. Smoke drifts slowly upward. Inside thick walls, life continues quietly, protected not by luxury, but by knowledge earned over generations. In the medieval world, clothing was never treated as decoration. It was not about identity, beauty, or personal choice. Clothing was survival equipment. Every layer worn on the body carried the responsibility of protecting life against cold, wind, rain, and exhaustion. Medieval people understood this deeply, even without scientific explanation. Their knowledge came from long experience and repeated loss. One of the most important survival techniques was layer discipline. Medieval people did not rely on a single heavy garment. They wore multiple layers, each serving a different purpose. Inner layers absorbed moisture from the body. Middle layers trapped warmth. Outer layers blocked wind and rain. This system allowed flexibility and protection in changing conditions. Wool was the most valuable material. It was favored not because it was comfortable, but because it continued to insulate even when wet. Medieval people lived in damp environments. Rain, snow, and condensation were unavoidable. Wool saved lives because it retained heat despite moisture. Linen and plant fibers were used closer to the skin, where breathability mattered. Clothing was adjusted constantly. Medieval people changed how they wore garments depending on weather, activity, and time of day. Cloaks were wrapped tightly during wind and loosened during movement. Sleeves were rolled or layered. Hoods were raised or lowered. Clothing was not static, it was managed. Wet clothing was considered dangerous. Rain-soaked garments drained body heat rapidly. Medieval survival depended on preventing this whenever possible. People avoided unnecessary exposure. When clothing became wet, it was dried near fire immediately. Entering the night in damp clothes could mean death before morning. Footwear required special attention. Feet were vulnerable to cold, injury, and infection. Medieval shoes were layered internally with cloth or straw for insulation. These linings were changed regularly. Wet feet weakened the body quickly. Dry feet preserved strength. Head coverings were essential. Medieval people observed that heat escaped rapidly from the head. Hoods, caps, and wraps were worn even indoors during cold seasons. Removing head coverings was avoided unless warmth was secure. Clothing repair was constant. A tear allowed wind and cold to penetrate. Small damage could become fatal. Needles, thread, and spare cloth were always kept close. Repair was not delayed. It was daily work. Color and fabric thickness also mattered. Darker fabrics absorbed heat better in sunlight. Thicker weaves blocked wind more effectively. These choices were practical, not aesthetic. Medieval people also practiced clothing restraint. Wearing too many layers during work caused sweating. Sweat cooled the body once activity stopped. This was dangerous. People learned to balance warmth and dryness carefully. Overheating was as risky as exposure. Children were taught these rules early. They learned how to wrap themselves, how to adjust layers, and how to recognize dangerous cold. Discipline around clothing was strict because mistakes could kill. During long winters, people often slept partially clothed. Removing layers fully was risky. Clothing remained part of the sleep system, working with bedding and shared body heat. Social behavior reinforced clothing survival. People reminded each other to cover up, adjust garments, or dry clothing. This was not interference. It was protection. Clothing was also reused and repurposed. Old garments became linings, wraps, or bedding. Nothing was wasted. Materials represented survival potential. Medieval people did not fight weather. They adapted to it through behavior. Clothing allowed them to move when needed and remain still when required. It created a barrier between fragile bodies and harsh conditions. As this extra long part settles into the quiet of medieval life, imagine figures wrapped in layered cloth, cloaks pulled tight, movements slow and deliberate against wind and rain. These garments carried memory, discipline, and survival stitched into every seam. In the medieval world, night was not a time of comfort or escape. It was a time of caution. Darkness removed vision, lowered temperatures, and increased vulnerability. Survival during the night depended on habits formed long before sleep ever began. Medieval people did not simply lie down and rest. They prepared for the night as carefully as they prepared for storms or hunger. Sleep itself was understood differently. Deep, uninterrupted sleep was rare. It was considered risky in many situations. Medieval people often slept lightly, waking several times through the night. This was not a flaw. It was a survival adaptation. Waking allowed people to check fire, adjust coverings, listen for danger, and respond to sudden changes. Sleeping arrangements were designed for warmth and awareness. Beds were raised off the ground to avoid cold air that settled near floors. Straw, hay, or rushes were used as insulation beneath the body. These materials trapped air and reduced heat loss. Bedding was refreshed regularly because dampness invited illness. Shared sleep was common. Families slept close together, sometimes in the same bed or on nearby pallets. This was not always about space. It was about shared warmth. Body heat was one of the most reliable sources of survival during cold nights. Isolation increased risk. Togetherness increased endurance. Clothing remained part of sleep. Medieval people rarely slept naked during cold seasons. Layers were adjusted rather than removed. Cloaks were used as blankets. Hoods were kept nearby. Exposure during sleep was dangerous, especially during sudden temperature drops. Fire management during the night was critical. Fires were not allowed to burn out completely. Embers were maintained carefully. Someone was always responsible for watching the hearth, even if only lightly awake. Fire failure during the night could lead to freezing before morning. Nighttime silence was intentional. Talking was reduced. Movement was minimized. Noise wasted energy and reduced awareness. Listening mattered more than speaking. Sounds carried information. Wind changes, animals moving or approaching footsteps. Breathing was also managed. Cold air entering the lungs weakened the body. People often slept with cloth near their faces, warming inhaled air. This reduced shock to the chest and preserved strength. Nighttime routines were consistent. People slept, woke briefly, checked conditions, and slept again. This segmented sleep pattern allowed survival without exhaustion. It also allowed adaptation to long winter nights. Children learned these habits early. They were taught where to sleep, how to stay covered, and how to respond if awakened. Night discipline was enforced gently but firmly. Illness was watched closely at night. Fever, shivering, or labored breathing required immediate response. Warmth and stillness were increased. Panic was avoided. Calm response mattered. Fear existed, but it was controlled. Medieval people did not allow imagination to run freely at night. Fear wasted energy and weakened judgment. Routine reduced fear by providing structure. Night was also a time of protection. Doors were secured, animals were checked. Tools were kept close. Readiness was maintained without alarm. Medieval sleep was not restful by modern standards, it was protective. Survival mattered more than comfort. Rest was shaped around danger rather than escape from it. As this long part settles into the darkness, imagine a medieval home at night. Fire embers glow softly. Bodies lie close together. Breath rises slowly in dim air. Awareness never fully sleeps. Night passes quietly, one careful hour at a time. In the medieval world, illness was not an unexpected event. It was a constant presence, moving quietly through villages, homes, and bodies. People did not ask whether sickness would come. They asked only when. Because of this, survival depended less on curing illness and more on preventing weakness before sickness took hold. Medieval people did not separate health from daily behavior. Health was not something treated only when lost. It was something protected constantly through routine, restraint, and awareness. These habits were learned slowly, passed from one generation to the next, shaped by long memory rather than written knowledge. One of the most important survival techniques was energy preservation. Medieval people understood that a tired body fell ill more easily. Exhaustion weakened resistance. Because of this, unnecessary labor was avoided whenever possible. Rest was not laziness. It was protection. People balanced work and stillness carefully, especially during cold, wet, or hungry seasons. Warmth played a central role in illness prevention. Cold weakened the body's ability to recover. Medieval people guarded warmth carefully, not only in winter, but during illness at any time of year. A sick person was kept near the fire, wrapped in layers, protected from drafts. Sudden exposure to cold air was avoided completely. Food during sickness followed strict rules. Heavy meals were avoided if digestion weakened the body. Warm broths, softened grains, and simple foods were preferred. Eating lightly but regularly preserved strength without overburdening the body. Starvation weakened healing, but overeating slowed recovery. Hydration mattered deeply. Warm liquids were preferred. Cold water during illness was avoided because it shocked the body. Herbal infusions, warmed ale, or diluted drinks were used to maintain moisture without chilling the chest or stomach. Isolation was practiced quietly. When someone fell ill, their movement was reduced. Visitors were limited. Shared bedding and utensils were avoided when possible. These actions were not driven by fear, but by observation. Communities that practiced separation lost fewer people. Cleanliness played a subtle role. While medieval hygiene was limited, certain behaviors reduced risk. Hands were rinsed before food preparation. Cooking vessels were cleaned. Bedding was aired. Clothing worn by the sick was separated when possible. These habits reduced spread without explanation. Smell guided behavior strongly. Medieval people associated foul smells with danger. Decaying matter, stagnant air, and waste were avoided. While the reasoning was imperfect, the behavior reduced exposure to harmful environments. Mental calm was also protective. Panic weakened the body. Fear increased exhaustion. Medieval culture discouraged dramatic reactions to illness. Calm response preserved energy and allowed the body to fight longer. Children were taught not to crowd the sick. Elders were protected carefully. Loss of experience weakened the community deeply. Preserving elders mattered for survival beyond the present illness. Doctors were rare and often ineffective. Survival depended on behavior, not treatment. Communities relied on routine, warmth, rest, and restraint far more than remedies. Illness prevention also included seasonal adaptation. People changed behavior with weather. During damp seasons, exposure was limited. During cold months, movement was reduced. During hunger periods, labor was conserved. These adjustments reduced stress on the body. Medieval people did not believe illness could always be avoided, but they believed suffering could be reduced. They focused on extending endurance rather than demanding recovery. These survival techniques were quiet and invisible. They did not look heroic, but they worked. They allowed people to live long enough to recover when recovery was possible. As this long part settles into stillness, imagine a medieval home during illness. Fire burns softly. Movement is slow. Voices are quiet. Care is patient. Survival continues not through medicine, but through behavior shaped by long experience. In the medieval world, danger did not always announce itself with noise or violence. Often, survival depended on the ability to sense trouble long before it arrived. Medieval people learned, through generations of experience, that avoiding danger was far safer than confronting it. Fighting was risky. Injury was often fatal. Survival favored awareness over bravery. One of the most important survival techniques was constant observation. Medieval people paid close attention to their surroundings. They noticed changes in behavior, sound, and routine. A quiet road, an unfamiliar face, or sudden absence of normal activity could signal danger. These signs were rarely ignored. Travel was approached cautiously. People rarely moved alone unless necessary. Groups reduced risk. Shared awareness increased safety. When travel was unavoidable, routes were chosen carefully. Known paths were preferred over shortcuts. Forests, narrow passes, and isolated roads were treated with suspicion. Ambush was a real threat. Time of movement mattered. Medieval people avoided traveling at night whenever possible. Darkness removed visibility and increased vulnerability. If movement after sunset was unavoidable, people moved quietly, stayed close together, and minimized exposure. Villages were structured for early warning. Homes faced inward. Entry points were limited. Dogs played a role in alerting communities to approaching strangers. Bells, horns, or simple shouted warnings could mobilize a response quickly. Awareness mattered more than weapons. Clothing and appearance were also used to avoid danger. Medieval people dressed according to local custom when traveling. Standing out attracted attention. Blending in reduced risk. Travelers avoided displaying wealth openly. Valuable items were hidden. Silence was a defensive tool. Loud behavior invited attention. Quiet movement allowed observation without being seen. Medieval people learned when to speak and when to remain silent. Silence preserved safety. Conflict avoidance was deeply ingrained. Disputes were often settled through mediation rather than violence. Fighting carried long-term risk. Even minor wounds could become fatal. Communities preferred restraint over escalation. Body language mattered. Medieval people learned to read posture, tone, and movement. Aggression, fear, or deception could be sensed through behavior. Trust was built slowly. Suspicion protected life. Homes were secured at night. Doors were barred. Tools were kept within reach not for combat but for deterrence. Readiness mattered more than confrontation. Children were taught awareness early. They learned which places were safe, which people were trusted, and when to return home. These lessons were strict because mistakes could not be undone. Medieval people also understood predictability as protection. Routine made abnormal events noticeable. When something disrupted normal rhythm, attention sharpened. Survival depended on noticing what did not belong. Violence was not glorified in daily life. It was feared and avoided. Survival depended on staying alive, not proving strength. Even during war, many survival techniques focused on avoidance. Hiding, waiting, retreating, and conserving resources. Direct confrontation was a last resort. The medieval world was dangerous but not chaotic. Those who survived learned to move carefully within it, sensing risk before it became unavoidable. As this long part settles into quiet reflection, imagine a medieval road at dusk, travelers moving slowly, eyes alert, voices low. Danger exists, but awareness keeps it at a distance. Survival continues through restraint rather than force. In the medieval world, work was unavoidable, but exhaustion was dangerous. People understood this through experience, not theory. A body pushed too far did not recover easily. Injury healed slowly. Illness followed fatigue. Because of this, survival depended not on working harder but on working wisely. Medieval people did not measure productivity by speed. They measured it by sustainability. Tasks were paced deliberately, shaped by seasons, daylight, and physical limits. This pacing was one of the most important survival techniques, even though it was rarely spoken aloud. Work followed the rhythm of the day. Heavy labor was done during daylight when warmth and visibility reduced risk. As light faded, effort slowed. Night was not for productivity, it was for preservation. Pushing work into darkness invited injury and error. Seasonal pacing mattered deeply. During planting and harvest, labor increased, but even then, effort was distributed carefully. No single day was allowed to break the body completely. People rested when weather forced them to, understanding that recovery was part of work, not separate from it. Micro-rest was common. Medieval workers paused frequently, even if only for moments. Leaning on tools, sitting briefly, adjusting clothing. These pauses preserved strength. They prevented collapse. Continuous strain was avoided whenever possible. Food timing supported pacing. Meals were placed strategically around labor. Heavy food before intense work. Lighter food afterward. This maintained energy without overwhelming digestion. Hunger was managed to avoid weakness. Communal labor reduced individual exhaustion. Tasks were shared. When one person weakened, another compensated. This cooperation prevented collapse and preserved long-term survival. Working alone increased risk. Weather dictated effort. Cold, heat, rain, and wind changed behavior immediately. Medieval people stopped work when conditions became dangerous. This was not laziness. It was risk management. Exposure could kill faster than hunger. Injury prevention mattered more than strength. Tools were used carefully. Sharp edges were respected. Accidents were feared because healing was uncertain. Slow, deliberate movement reduced mistakes. Children were introduced to work gradually. Heavy labor was delayed until bodies strengthened. Overworking children weakened future survival. Medieval societies understood this balance instinctively. Elders adjusted roles with age. Experience replaced strength. Observation replaced exertion. This preserved knowledge while protecting bodies that no longer healed quickly. Rest days existed, though not always formal. Religious observances, weather delays, and seasonal pauses provided recovery time. These breaks were not wasted. They were survival tools. Mental pacing mattered too. Medieval people did not rush decisions. Stress exhausted the mind and body. Calm planning preserved clarity. Panic caused mistakes. Sleep patterns supported recovery. Segmented sleep allowed rest without vulnerability. Naps occurred naturally after labor. Rest was integrated into life. Work was never endless. Survival required limits. Medieval people respected those limits because ignoring them meant death. As this long part settles into quiet reflection, imagine fields worked slowly, tools moving steadily, pauses taken without guilt. Life continues not through relentless effort, but through measured endurance passed quietly across generations. In the medieval world, survival was not only a matter of food, shelter, or strength. It was also a matter of the mind. Fear, uncertainty, and emotional collapse could weaken a person as surely as hunger or cold. Because of this, medieval people developed quiet techniques to control emotion, manage fear, and remain steady in a world where danger was always close. Life in medieval times offered little certainty. Illness could strike without warning. Weather could destroy crops overnight. War, bandits, or fire could erase years of labor in a single moment. People did not expect safety. Expectation itself was dangerous. Instead, they trained themselves to live with uncertainty. One of the most important survival techniques was emotional restraint. Medieval culture discouraged open panic. Fear was acknowledged but not indulged. Loud displays of distress weakened group morale and invited mistakes. Calm behavior protected everyone. This restraint was taught early. Children learned not to cry loudly unless injured. They learned to observe adults during crisis. Calm response was modeled repeatedly. Emotional discipline became instinct, not instruction. Routine played a powerful role in fear management. When uncertainty surrounded daily life, routine created stability. Waking, eating, working, resting, these patterns grounded people even when external conditions were unstable. Routine reduced anxiety by creating predictability. Religious practice also served survival beyond belief. Regular prayer, ritual, and observance structured time. These practices gave people a sense of order when the world felt chaotic. Even those who feared deeply found comfort in repetition. Another survival technique was acceptance of loss. Medieval people lived close to death. Losing family members was common. Grief was real, but life did not stop. Survival required continuing daily function despite emotional pain. Communities supported this by maintaining routine rather than allowing collapse. Storytelling played a role in emotional endurance. Stories of past hardship reminded people that suffering had been survived before. These stories did not deny pain. They placed it within a larger pattern. This reduced isolation and despair. Fear of the unknown was managed through familiarity. People stayed close to what they knew, their land, their people, their habits. Novelty increased risk. Familiar routines reduced it. Silence also helped emotional control. Medieval people did not speak constantly. Quiet allowed reflection and prevented emotional escalation. Words were used carefully, especially during crisis. Another important technique was shared burden. Fear was easier to carry together. Communities faced hardship collectively. No one was expected to endure alone. Shared responsibility reduced emotional collapse. Medieval people also practiced delayed reaction. Immediate emotional response often led to poor decisions. People learned to pause, observe, and wait before acting. Waiting allowed danger to reveal itself more clearly. Music, simple games, and conversation existed even during hardship, but they were restrained. Joy was allowed, but excess was avoided. Emotional balance mattered more than escape. Sleep played a role here as well. Exhaustion increased fear. Rest preserved emotional control. Even fragmented sleep helped stabilize the mind. Belief in fate reduced anxiety. If events were part of a larger order, panic felt less useful. This belief did not remove fear, but it softened it. The medieval mind survived not because it was fearless, but because it was trained to endure uncertainty without breaking. Emotional strength was quiet, practiced daily, and rarely celebrated. As this very long part settles into stillness, imagine a medieval household facing uncertainty with calm faces, measured voices, and steady routine. Fear exists, but it does not rule. Life continues through emotional discipline shaped by generations. In the medieval world, the most terrifying threat was not sudden danger, but long absence of relief. Famine, siege, and prolonged crisis tested survival in ways no single storm or illness ever could. These were not moments to endure. They were conditions that stretched across months, sometimes years. Survival depended on habits that allowed life to continue even when hope faded slowly. Famine was not rare. Crop failure, weather shifts, war, or trade collapse could empty storehouses quickly. Medieval people expected scarcity to return again and again. Because of this, they developed techniques for living with hunger, not just avoiding starvation. One of the most important techniques was hunger normalization. Hunger was not treated as an emergency at first. It was accepted quietly. By accepting mild hunger early, people avoided panic. Panic led to overeating remaining supplies. Calm restraint extended survival. Food was stretched deliberately. Grain was mixed with fillers. Bread became thinner. Soups were diluted. Portions were reduced slowly, not suddenly. This gradual reduction allowed bodies to adapt. Sudden starvation weakened people faster than controlled hunger. During famine, food hierarchy became strict. Children, the sick, and those performing necessary labor were prioritized. This was not emotional favoritism. It was strategic survival. Preserving the future and the essential preserved the group. Communities shared information carefully. Knowledge of hidden stores, alternative foods, and distant resources circulated quietly. Foraging expanded cautiously. Roots, bark, wild greens, and previously ignored plants were used. Knowledge of edible plants saved lives. During sieges, survival became even narrower. Cities sealed themselves against attackers. Supplies were rationed strictly. Waste was minimized completely. Everything became reusable. Even bones were boiled repeatedly. Leather was softened and eaten in extreme cases. These actions were desperate but structured. Water discipline intensified. Clean sources were guarded. Contaminated water killed faster than hunger. Boiling and filtering became essential. Movement during siege was limited. Energy conservation mattered. Fighting was avoided unless necessary. Survival favored waiting rather than resistance. Illness during famine was deadly. Weak bodies could not recover easily. Care focused on warmth, rest, and small nourishment. Emotional calm mattered deeply. Despair weakened the will to continue routine. Social order was critical. Panic destroyed survival chances. Communities enforced rules quietly but firmly. Hoarding threatened everyone. Sharing, though painful, extended group survival. Children learned quickly during crisis. Play disappeared. Observation replaced innocence. These experiences shaped future behavior deeply. Belief systems offered structure. Ritual continued even when food disappeared. This maintained morale and routine. Routine kept people functioning. Memory played a role. Elders remembered past famines. Their warnings shaped behavior. Communities that listened survived longer. The goal during long crisis was not comfort, it was continuity. Each day survived was success. Medieval people did not survive famine and siege because they were cruel or fearless. They survived because they were disciplined, patient, and realistic. They accepted limits rather than denying them. As this very long part settles into the quiet weight of endurance, imagine a medieval town sealed against the world. hunger present but controlled, routines continuing despite weakness. Survival stretches forward one careful day at a time. In the medieval world, disaster was never considered the end of life. Fire, flood, famine, war, and disease could destroy years of work in a single moment. Villages burned, fields flooded, families vanished. Yet medieval survival depended on one powerful skill that often goes unnoticed: adaptability. The ability to continue after loss was as important as avoiding danger itself. When disaster struck, medieval people did not wait for rescue. Help rarely came from outside. Survival required immediate adjustment. People accepted damage quickly because denial wasted time and energy. Acceptance allowed action. Rebuilding began almost immediately, even while loss was still fresh. Shelters were repaired with whatever materials remained. Broken structures were reused rather than replaced. Burned wood became fuel. Fallen beams became tools. Nothing was discarded if it could still serve a purpose. Land use shifted after disaster. Fields damaged by flood were abandoned temporarily. New plots were cleared. Crop choices changed based on soil condition and remaining seed. Medieval people understood that repeating old patterns after disaster invited failure. Adaptation preserved survival. Labor roles changed as well. Those injured took lighter tasks. Elders guided rather than worked. Children contributed where possible. Survival required flexibility, not rigid hierarchy. Communities reorganized quietly. Leadership emerged through usefulness rather than title. Those with practical knowledge guided rebuilding. Authority followed experience, not power. Food habits adjusted again. Diets changed based on availability. People learned to eat what remained rather than what they preferred. Taste mattered less than nutrition. Survival rewarded flexibility. Emotional recovery was managed through routine. Grief existed, but routine continued. Work returned slowly. Shared labor reduced isolation. Keeping hands busy preserved mental stability. Belief systems helped process loss. Disaster was framed as part of life's cycle. This did not remove pain, but it prevented paralysis. Acceptance allowed continuation. Memory of disaster shaped future planning. Structures were rebuilt stronger. Storage increased. Routes changed. Preparation improved. Each disaster taught lessons that shaped survival strategies for the next generation. Isolation after disaster was dangerous. Medieval people regrouped quickly. Even broken communities gathered together. Togetherness increased survival chances. Time was not wasted blaming causes. Medieval survival focused on what remained rather than what was lost. This mindset preserved energy. Children absorbed these lessons deeply. They learned that loss did not end life. Adaptation did. These lessons shaped future resilience. Medieval adaptability was quiet and practical. It did not look heroic, it looked like continuation. Life moved forward slowly, carrying scars but refusing to stop. As this ultra-long part settles into calm reflection, imagine a medieval village after disaster. Smoke still lingers. Structures are damaged. Yet people move steadily, repairing, adjusting, rebuilding. Survival continues, shaped not by perfection, but by adaptability learned through hardship. In the medieval world, survival knowledge was never written for safety. Books were rare, fragile, and inaccessible to most people. Instead, The most important survival techniques lived in memory. Memory was not personal. It was communal. It was carried by elders, repeated in stories, embedded in habits, and passed quietly from one generation to the next. This oral survival system was one of the strongest tools medieval people had. Knowledge did not disappear when buildings burned or crops failed. It moved with people. It lived in voices, routines, and repeated behavior. Survival wisdom was preserved because it was used daily, not because it was recorded. Elders played a central role in this system. They were not respected only for age, but for lived experience. They remembered winters that killed livestock, summers that dried wells, and famines that emptied towns. These memories shaped advice. When elders warned early, communities listened. Ignoring memory often meant repeating disaster. Stories were the primary way knowledge traveled. These stories were not entertainment alone. They were instruction disguised as narrative. A story about a harsh winter taught when to store food earlier. A tale of illness taught isolation behavior. A memory of fire taught safer hearth placement. Stories carried warning without command. Children learned survival not through explanation but observation. They watched how adults reacted to weather changes, illness, or shortage. They learned when silence mattered, when movement was dangerous, and when patience saved lives. This learning was constant and subtle. Repetition was intentional. The same advice was repeated year after year. The same warnings resurfaced each season. This repetition fixed knowledge into behavior. Survival techniques became instinct rather than choice. Memory also shaped timing. Medieval people remembered when danger usually appeared. Flood seasons, disease seasons, hunger months. These patterns were known. Preparation followed memory rather than calendars. Certain behaviors became ritualized because they worked. Cleaning before winter, repairing before storms, rationing before scarcity. Ritual preserved memory by turning survival into routine. Communities reinforced memory collectively. When someone ignored tradition, others intervened. Not out of control, but protection. Survival knowledge belonged to everyone. Loss strengthened memory. When disaster struck, the lesson became permanent. Stories grew sharper, warnings grew stronger. Painful memory saved future lives. Knowledge adapted as well. Survival techniques changed slowly as environments changed. Memory was not static. It evolved through experience. This oral system allowed medieval societies to survive repeated crises without formal education. Survival wisdom lived longer than any structure. As this mega-long part settles into quiet reflection, imagine a medieval evening. Elders speak softly. Children listen without knowing they are learning. Survival knowledge moves forward, carried gently by memory, shaping lives long after the night ends. In the medieval world, survival was never only about individual skill. It depended heavily on order. Without order, communities collapsed quickly under pressure. Hunger turned to chaos. Fear turned to violence. Medieval societies understood this through long experience, and because of that, they developed strict but quiet social rules that kept life functioning even during extreme hardship. These rules were rarely written down. They lived in expectation and habit. Everyone knew their place, not because of oppression alone, but because disorder threatened survival. Clear roles reduced confusion. Confusion wasted time. Time wasted during crisis cost lives. Hierarchy played a survival role. Elders advised, adults worked, children observed and assisted. This structure ensured that experience guided decisions while strength carried out labor. During disaster, this order prevented argument and delay. Discipline was enforced subtly. Loud defiance, panic, or selfish behavior was discouraged immediately. Not always through punishment, but through social pressure. Shame was powerful. A person who endangered others by breaking rules lost trust. Trust was essential for survival. Rules governed food distribution. Eating out of turn, hoarding, or wasting food was seen as dangerous behavior. Communities monitored one another closely. Fairness preserved morale. Unequal survival weakened group stability. Movement was also regulated. Leaving a settlement during crisis required permission or consensus. Lone action endangered rescue efforts and resource planning. Staying together increased survival odds. Silence during certain moments was expected. During night, illness, or danger, noise was controlled. Silence preserved awareness and calm. Speaking without purpose was discouraged. Conflict resolution favored containment over escalation. Arguments were settled quickly or postponed. Fighting drained energy and caused injury. Survival demanded restraint. Religious and cultural rituals reinforced discipline. Regular observance structured time and behavior. These rituals were anchors during chaos. They reminded people that order still existed. Punishment existed, but survival focused. Exile, for example, was severe because isolation killed quickly. This reinforced cooperation. Children learned these rules by living within them. Discipline shaped instinct. Survival behavior became automatic. Medieval order was not gentle, but it was effective. It allowed communities to endure conditions that would otherwise tear them apart. As this long part settles into calm reflection, imagine a medieval village under strain. Food is scarce. Weather is harsh. Yet routines continue. Rules hold. Order remains. Survival flows, not from freedom, but from shared discipline carried quietly through generations. In the medieval world, punishment was not designed primarily to be cruel. It was designed to protect survival. Communities lived close together, depended on shared resources, and faced constant external threats. Any behavior that endangered food, safety, or order was treated seriously, because one person's mistake could weaken many lives. Correction began long before formal punishment. Most medieval societies relied first on social correction. Elders, family members, and neighbors intervened early when behavior drifted toward danger. Quiet warnings, public reminders, and visible disapproval were often enough to restore order. This early correction prevented larger crises. When stronger measures were required, punishment focused on deterrence rather than removal. The goal was to correct behavior quickly and visibly so that others would not repeat it. Public punishments were common not for spectacle, but for instruction. Seeing consequences reinforced memory. Shame was one of the strongest tools. Being placed in public view, restrained, marked, or mocked, signaled loss of trust. Trust was essential for survival. Losing it weakened one's position in the community. This made correction effective without constant violence. Physical punishment existed, but it was often limited. Severe injury reduced labor capacity. A weakened worker threatened food production and defense. Because of this, Punishment balanced pain with preservation of usefulness. Survival required bodies intact. Exile was one of the harshest punishments. Being removed from the community meant near certain death. This threat reinforced cooperation. People understood that isolation was more dangerous than hunger or cold. Punishments related directly to the offense. Food theft threatened survival, so penalties were severe. Fire misuse endangered everyone, so correction was immediate. Violence within the community was controlled strictly because internal conflict weakened defense. Children were corrected early and consistently. Discipline shaped instinct. Survival behavior was learned before adulthood. Punishment was part of education rather than revenge. Religious belief reinforced correction. Breaking rules was framed as disrupting order, not just law. This added moral weight to discipline. Obedience preserved balance. Correction was public because survival knowledge needed reinforcement. Private punishment failed to teach others. Visibility mattered. Medieval punishment systems were harsh but functional. They existed to preserve group survival in environments where tolerance for risk was low. As this long part settles into quiet reflection, imagine a medieval square where correction takes place calmly, visibly, and purposefully. Behavior is shaped not by cruelty, but by necessity. Order continues. Survival holds. In the medieval world, survival depended not only on food, shelter, and discipline, but on trust. Trust was not emotional or abstract. It was practical. Communities were small, resources were limited, and danger was constant. People relied on one another daily, often for life itself. Because of this, trust became one of the most carefully protected survival systems of the age. Reputation mattered deeply. A person's past behavior shaped how others treated them in moments of crisis. Someone known to share food during shortage, to follow rules during danger, or to remain calm under pressure was trusted quickly. That trust could mean access to shelter, help during illness, or protection during conflict. Reputation was built slowly and lost quickly. One act of selfishness during hardship could damage trust for years. Medieval people understood that memory was long. Communities remembered who broke rules, who hoarded, who abandoned others. These memories guided future decisions. Social memory functioned as an informal record system. Without written documentation, behavior itself became history. Stories circulated quietly. Names carried meaning. A person's actions followed them beyond a single event. This created powerful incentive to behave in ways that preserved group survival. Trust governed access to shared resources. Wells, ovens, tools, and storage areas were often communal. Misuse threatened everyone. Only those considered reliable were allowed unsupervised access. Trust was survival currency. During crisis, trust determined priority. When food was scarce or shelter limited, those trusted were helped first. This was not cruelty. It was risk management. Helping an unreliable person endangered the group. Marriage and family ties also reinforced trust systems. Families known for discipline and cooperation formed alliances. These alliances strengthened survival networks across households and villages. Strangers were treated cautiously. Hospitality existed, but trust was not given freely. Newcomers were observed before being integrated. This protected communities from risk. Trust influenced leadership. Leaders were chosen based on experience and reliability, not popularity. A leader who broke trust weakened survival chances. Authority followed reputation. Children learned trust rules early. They observed consequences. Trust shaped behavior before law or force was needed. Even during punishment, trust played a role. Those who accepted correction and restored behavior could regain trust slowly. Survival allowed redemption when possible. Medieval trust systems reduced the need for constant enforcement. Memory did the work. Reputation guided behavior naturally. These systems were harsh but effective. They allowed communities to function without constant violence or surveillance. As this long part settles into quiet reflection, imagine a medieval village where everyone knows one another's history. Actions matter. Memory persists. Trust flows carefully, shaping survival in ways unseen but deeply felt. In the medieval world, one of the most powerful survival techniques was also the quietest. It was waiting. Knowing when not to move, not to speak, not to act, and not to interfere often kept people alive longer than any weapon or tool. Medieval life rewarded patience far more than urgency. People lived in an environment where acting too quickly could be fatal. Weather changed suddenly. Roads were dangerous. Illness spread fast. Fire escaped control easily. Because of this, medieval survival culture taught restraint as wisdom. Action was delayed until conditions were clear. Travel was governed by waiting. Roads were not used simply because they existed. People waited for daylight, for clear weather, for companions. Moving too early or too late increased risk. Waiting reduced exposure. During conflict, waiting saved lives. Medieval people avoided confrontation whenever possible. They waited for danger to pass, for attackers to move on, for conditions to improve. Hiding, remaining still, or retreating was often safer than fighting. Survival favored delay over bravery. Illness demanded patience. Medieval people did not rush recovery. Rest was extended. Activity resumed slowly. Acting healthy too soon invited relapse. Waiting allowed the body to regain strength. Weather demanded waiting. Storms were respected. Floods were not challenged. Cold spells were endured rather than resisted. Acting against nature weakened survival chances. Waiting allowed danger to reveal its limits. Food scarcity required waiting. Supplies were stretched. Eating was delayed when possible. Hunger was tolerated to avoid starvation later. Immediate satisfaction threatened long-term survival. Social conflict was also managed through delay. Arguments were paused. Decisions were postponed. Waiting allowed emotions to cool. Acting during anger caused division and violence. Patience preserved order. Medieval justice also relied on waiting. Accusations were considered carefully. Immediate punishment risked error. Delay allowed reflection and community input. Wrong punishment weakened trust. Children were taught patience early. They learned to wait for food, permission, safety. Impulse was corrected gently but firmly. Survival required control. Waiting also shaped belief. Time was accepted as a force larger than human will. This belief reduced anxiety and rash action. Medieval people understood that not all problems required immediate response. Some resolved themselves. Acting unnecessarily wasted energy. This patience did not mean passivity. It meant controlled readiness. People remained alert, prepared, but restrained. As this long part settles into calm stillness, imagine a medieval community pausing before action, watching skies, listening to wind, feeling time stretch. Survival continues through restraint rather than movement. In the medieval world, silence was not emptiness. It was protection. Words carried risk. Sound traveled far in quiet landscapes. Information moved quickly through small communities. Because of this, knowing when to remain silent became a powerful survival skill, practiced carefully and taught quietly over generations. Medieval people lived in close quarters. Homes were small, villages were dense, privacy was limited. Anything spoken could be overheard, repeated, or misunderstood. Because of this, speech was measured, saying less reduced danger. Silence protected against accusation. Words spoken carelessly could be twisted into evidence of wrongdoing. In times of fear or tension, suspicion spread easily. Remaining quiet avoided drawing attention. Attention invited scrutiny. Scrutiny endangered survival. Secrecy protected resources. Food stores, hidden supplies, and safe routes were not discussed openly. Knowledge was shared selectively. Revealing too much increased risk of theft or conflict. Silence guarded survival assets. During conflict, silence saved lives. Loud movement attracted danger. Quiet presence allowed hiding, escape, or waiting. Medieval people learned to move softly, speak minimally, and listen carefully. Listening revealed more than speaking ever could. Silence also shaped trust. People who spoke excessively were seen as risky. Those who controlled speech were respected. Reputation favored restraint. Words were power, and power required control. In illness and crisis, silence reduced panic. Loud fear weakened morale. Calm quiet preserved stability. Communities that remained quiet under pressure survived longer. Religious practice reinforced silence. Reflection, prayer, and stillness were valued. Silence was framed as discipline. This belief strengthened survival habits. Children were taught when silence was required. Nighttime, danger, illness, and scarcity demanded quiet. Noise was corrected early. Survival required awareness. Medieval law also relied on silence. Confessions, accusations, and testimony carried weight. Speaking unnecessarily increased risk. Waiting and observing reduced error. Secrecy also protected movement. Travel plans were shared minimally. Surprise preserved safety. Predictability invited attack. Silence preserved energy. Speaking required breath, warmth, and focus. During cold or hunger, conserving energy mattered. Quiet preserved strength. Medieval people understood that not every thought needed expression. Expression increased exposure, silence reduced it. As this long part settles into deep stillness, imagine a medieval night where voices are low, movement is careful, and listening dominates. Survival flows quietly through restraint, secrecy, and awareness. Life continues, protected by words left unspoken. In the medieval world, survival did not come from excitement. It came from repetition. Day after day, season after season, life followed patterns that modern eyes might call boring. But this boredom was not failure. It was protection. Medieval people survived because their lives were predictable, slow, and repetitive. Monotony reduced risk. When every day followed a familiar rhythm, danger stood out clearly. Anything unusual became noticeable immediately. A strange sound, a missing person, a delayed task, these changes signaled threat. Predictability sharpened awareness. Daily routines rarely changed. Wake at the same time, tend animals the same way, prepare food using the same steps, repair tools in the same place. This repetition turned survival behavior into instinct. No thinking was required. Thinking wasted time during crisis. Boredom preserved energy. Excitement increased movement, speech, and emotion. All of these consumed strength. Medieval life minimized stimulation so energy could be reserved for real danger. Calm days prepared bodies for hard ones. Children grew up inside repetition. They learned survival habits without instruction. They absorbed rhythm. Routine shaped memory. Survival behavior became automatic long before adulthood. Long winters intensified monotony. Darkness lasted months. Tasks were limited. Conversation repeated. Silence stretched. Medieval people learned to endure mental stillness without breaking. This mental endurance was essential. Those who needed constant stimulation suffered deeply. Repetition also stabilized emotion. Emotional highs and lows were dangerous. Calm predictability kept fear and panic under control. Boring days created emotional balance. Work repetition reduced injury. Familiar movements prevented mistakes. Tools were handled the same way each time. Consistency protected hands, backs, and joints. Injury threatened survival more than slow progress. Social repetition reinforced order. Everyone knew what to expect from others. Roles were clear. Confusion was rare. This reduced conflict and saved energy. Seasonal repetition guided preparation. Each year followed the same survival cycle. Memory guided action. Surprises decreased over time. Experience replaced uncertainty. Religion reinforced monotony. Regular rituals marked time. Repetition created comfort. The world felt ordered even when harsh. Medieval people did not chase novelty. Novelty meant unpredictability. Predictability meant survival. Enduring boredom was a skill. It required patience, restraint, and acceptance. Medieval people learned this skill deeply. They lived inside repetition without resisting it. As this ultra-long part settles into deep calm, imagine a medieval village living the same day again and again. No rush, no excitement, just rhythm. In that rhythm, life survives quietly, protected by predictability. In the medieval world, survival was closely tied to an understanding of limits. People did not believe life could be endlessly controlled or extended. Instead, they lived with a constant awareness that strength ended, food ended, warmth ended, and even life itself had boundaries. This acceptance was not surrender. It was a survival strategy shaped by reality. Medieval people understood that fighting limits wasted energy. Energy was precious. When limits were reached, behavior adjusted. This mindset protected people from exhaustion, despair, and reckless action. Survival depended on recognizing when effort should stop and restraint should begin. Physical limits were respected early. When the body weakened, work slowed. When illness appeared, movement stopped. Pushing beyond capacity often led to death. Medieval survival favored listening to the body rather than forcing it. Food limits shaped behavior deeply. People accepted smaller portions during scarcity without expectation of abundance returning quickly. This acceptance reduced panic. Panic caused hoarding and violence. Calm acceptance preserved order. Environmental limits mattered as well. Flooded land was avoided rather than reclaimed immediately. Frozen ground was left untouched. Storm seasons halted travel. Medieval people waited for conditions to change instead of challenging them. Social limits were enforced quietly. Individuals were expected to stay within their roles. Overreaching caused disruption. Disruption threatened survival. Balance mattered more than ambition. Mental limits were acknowledged. Grief, fear, and fatigue were accepted as natural states. Medieval people did not expect constant happiness or motivation. Emotional endurance meant continuing routine even when feeling empty. Death itself was integrated into survival thinking. Loss did not stop daily life. Communities continued work, food preparation, and care despite grief. This continuation preserved the living. Children learned limits early. They were taught when to stop, when to wait, and when to accept disappointment. These lessons prepared them for a life shaped by restraint. Belief systems reinforced acceptance. Fate, divine order, and cycles of life framed limits as natural rather than unjust. This reduced resistance and emotional collapse. Acceptance also prevented reckless hope. Hope without realism caused people to risk food, safety, and shelter prematurely. Medieval survival required hope to remain quiet and controlled. Communities that accepted limits endured longer. Those who denied limits fractured under pressure. Acceptance preserved unity. This mindset did not remove suffering. It made suffering survivable. Limits defined safe boundaries for behavior. As this long part continues its slow rhythm, imagine medieval life moving forward within clear boundaries. Effort rises and falls. Loss is absorbed. Routine continues. Survival flows through acceptance rather than resistance. In the medieval world, recovery did not arrive with clear endings or fresh beginnings. Life did not pause to acknowledge that hardship had passed. Instead, survival continued through unfinished recovery, a slow return to function without ceremony. This way of living protected people from disappointment and false expectation. Recovery was treated as process, not event. After crisis, medieval people did not expect life to feel whole again. Loss lingered. Weakness remained. Damage stayed visible. But routine returned anyway. Fields were worked before strength fully came back. Tools were used even when hands still ached. This gradual return prevented collapse caused by waiting for perfect conditions. Communities accepted that scars were permanent. Burned buildings were reused. Damaged tools were repaired imperfectly. Injured bodies adjusted rather than healed fully. Survival did not require perfection. It required function. This mindset prevented paralysis. Waiting for full recovery wasted time and resources. Action resumed at reduced capacity. This slow movement forward kept life going. Social life reflected this unfinished state. Celebrations were rare after disaster. Joy returned quietly, mixed with memory of loss. Laughter existed but carefully. Excess emotion threatened balance. Food habits adjusted slowly. Scarcity often lingered after crisis. People did not assume abundance would return quickly. Diets remained restricted. Caution persisted. Children grew up seeing adults work through weakness. This taught resilience without false optimism. Recovery was normal, not dramatic. Belief systems reinforced continuation. There was no promise that suffering ended cleanly. Life moved forward carrying weight. Communities avoided closure. Closure suggested finality. Medieval survival accepted continuation without resolution. This reduced emotional shock. Memory stayed active. Lessons from hardship were kept close. Forgetting too quickly invited repetition. As this long part continues, imagine medieval life slowly moving forward, incomplete but functional. Nothing feels finished, yet survival continues quietly, step by step, without pause. In the medieval world, hope existed, but it was not loud and it was never guaranteed. Hope was not spoken as a promise. It was not framed as certainty. Instead, it lived quietly beside uncertainty, shaped by experience rather than expectation. This form of hope was one of the most important survival techniques of all. Medieval people did not expect tomorrow to be better. Expectation created weakness. When hope became expectation, disappointment followed, and disappointment drained strength. Because of this, hope was kept small, controlled, and practical. It was not about outcomes, it was about continuation. Hope appeared in routine, waking up, preparing food, tending animals, repairing tools. These actions carried an unspoken belief that life would continue if effort continued. Hope was not spoken, it was practiced. People did not ask whether things would improve. They asked what could still be done today. This narrowed focus protected the mind from despair. Survival depended on attention to the immediate rather than the distant future. During long hardship, medieval people avoided false reassurance. Elders did not promise that famine would end soon or that illness would pass quickly. They spoke carefully. Over-promising destroyed trust. Honest uncertainty preserved stability. Religious belief shaped hope without guarantee. Prayer was offered without certainty of reward. Faith was not insurance. It was endurance. This belief allowed people to continue even when outcomes were unclear. Children learned hope through observation. They saw adults continue work despite loss. They learned that hope meant continuing action, not waiting for rescue. This lesson shaped resilience deeply. Hope was also shared quietly. A repaired roof, a small harvest, a surviving animal. These moments were acknowledged without celebration. Small successes mattered more than grand victories. Communities avoided imagining distant futures. Planning extended only as far as necessary. This limited disappointment and preserved morale. Survival favored short horizons. Hope did not remove fear. Fear remained present. But fear did not dominate behavior. Controlled hope balanced fear without denying it. When hope failed, routine remained. Routine carried people through moments when belief weakened. Action replaced belief when belief faltered. This restrained hope prevented collapse. People who hoped loudly suffered deeply when hope broke. People who hoped quietly endured longer. As this long part continues its calm rhythm, imagine medieval life moving forward without promises, without guarantees, guided only by the decision to continue one more day. Hope exists, but it whispers, and in that whisper, survival continues. In the medieval world, survival was not only about keeping the body alive, it was also about preserving identity. When famine, war, disease, or displacement stripped people of land, wealth, and family, something quieter remained at risk: the sense of who a person was. Medieval survival included techniques for protecting this inner continuity: even when everything external changed. Identity in medieval life was not individual in the modern sense. It was woven into family, craft, faith, and routine. When disaster struck, these anchors were threatened. Survival depended on holding on to them in small, deliberate ways. Work played a central role in preserving identity. Even when work produced little, people continued familiar tasks. A farmer tended soil even when crops failed. A craftsperson repaired tools even when trade collapsed. These actions reinforced purpose. Purpose protected the mind from collapse. Names carried weight. Family names, lineage, and remembered ancestors anchored people during loss. Remembering where one came from mattered deeply. Oral memory preserved identity when records were lost. Faith rituals reinforced continuity. Even when churches were damaged or leaders lost, prayer and observance continued privately. These practices connected individuals to a larger story that existed beyond immediate suffering. Clothing also preserved identity. Even when garments were worn thin or patched repeatedly, people maintained familiar styles. These small consistencies reminded them who they were. Language mattered. Dialects, sayings, and familiar phrases were preserved. Speaking as one always had reinforced belonging. Identity lived in speech. Community roles survived even when conditions changed. Elders advised, parents guided, children learned. These roles continued regardless of circumstance. Role continuity preserved structure. Memory of normal life was not erased. It was carried quietly. Stories of past routines reminded people that hardship was not the only reality. Identity preservation reduced despair. People who lost all sense of self struggled to continue. Those who retained even fragments endured longer. This survival technique was invisible but powerful. It required repetition, memory, and restraint. Identity became shelter when physical shelter failed. As this very long part continues, imagine medieval people carrying their sense of self quietly through ruin and recovery, holding on to who they were even when everything else shifted. In the medieval world, time itself was understood differently. Survival was not measured in hours or deadlines. It was measured in seasons, in cycles, and in endurance. People did not rush time forward. They lived inside it. This way of seeing time shaped how survival was approached, how suffering was endured, and how life continued without collapse. Medieval people did not expect quick change. Improvement was slow, often invisible. A bad year did not promise a good one next. Because of this, survival depended on patience with time itself. Waiting was not wasted. It was necessary. Days were long and repetitive. Years followed familiar patterns. This slow passage reduced panic. When hardship arrived, it was not seen as interruption, but as part of the cycle. This perception softened fear. Time was not something to defeat. It was something to move alongside. Medieval people adjusted themselves to time rather than demanding time adjust to them. This acceptance preserved energy and mental balance. Endurance mattered more than progress. Being alive tomorrow mattered more than being better tomorrow. Survival favored continuation over improvement. This perspective shaped every survival technique we have explored. Food was stretched across time. Shelter was built to last seasons. Discipline preserved order over long hardship. Memory carried lessons forward. Identity endured beyond loss. Hope remained quiet and controlled. Nothing in medieval survival aimed for perfection. Everything aimed for enough. Enough food, enough warmth, enough strength, enough will to continue. And so medieval survival was not dramatic. It was slow, it was quiet, it was repetitive, it was disciplined, it worked. As we let this history rest, imagine a medieval world settling into its familiar rhythm. Days pass, seasons turn, people continue. Survival flows not from innovation, but from patience learned over generations. Here there is no final victory, no clear resolution, only continuation.